We'll call the meeting to order. Woodland Davis Clean Water Agency. Welcome everybody here in attendance today. 3 members of the board are present. Are you aware, Eric, if Joe will be here?
I have not heard his status or if he's going to be here or not.
Well, we'll
be on his bicycle right
here. Oh, okay.
First, any changes to the agenda? Anybody wishes to entertain? Very good. We will proceed then with public comment. There's an opportunity for the public to address the agency board on any item that's not on the agenda. I'd like to make a public comment since it's not on the agenda. As a member of the public and as a council member from the city of Davis, there will be an election next Tuesday. City of Woodland, I'm sorry.
That's news to me.
Gosh, I was raised in Davis, so I guess that's okay for that slip to have happened. My parents still live here, but the item of great concern to myself as well as to the cities throughout California is Proposition 22. A yes vote on Proposition 22 would prohibit the state from further invading the coffers of local government. I urge voters to vote yes on Proposition 22, and so does the unanimous City Council in Woodland. And I'm not aware of Davis's position.
It was unanimous with us.
That was a unanimous vote in the city of Davis. In our opinion, robbing Peter to pay Paul, as worthy as the Pauls are and as needy as the Pauls are, robbing Peter to pay Paul is not an acceptable solution to the budgetary problems of the state of California. And doing that on the backs of local government is not warranted. So I urge a yes vote on Proposition 22.
Can I throw in a public comment also?
Absolutely.
Thank you, sir. When you look at the Sacramento Bee's endorsements, they are urging a no vote on 22, and their reasoning was that it's a power grab by the redevelopment agencies, which leads me to believe they don't actually know what a redevelopment agency is. So I just like to throw that in there because that's not what it is. It's actually opposing the power grab by the state.
All right, moving on. Mr. Don Saylor, would you come forward? Let's
Yes, it's on.
Yeah, that'd be great. Actually, Mayor Saylor, to say it correctly, was one of the original founding members of this board, and we enjoyed having him participate on the board. We all want to thank him. Our thanks are not adequate. We have a little certificate of appreciation for you, Don, but we certainly appreciate your collaborative spirit and the way in which you engage this board, all of us, in the process that this agency is involved in. So we all thank you.
Thank you, Stephen.
Now, I told Don that he couldn't give the 10-minute version of his talk. He had to narrow it down to 5 because we're all wanting to get to the Giants game this afternoon. So,
Well, I'm not a baseball fan, so it's. Bill, I think you hit the nail on the head. This board has been an extremely collaborative, effective operating body through the formative stages of the agency. It's been a delight to work with each of you on this effort. I was so struck when we had our joint meeting of the Woodland and Davis City Councils together in this room, and had such a strong degree of unanimity in support of this project that will meet the needs of both of our communities and reduce the ratepayers' cost by significant amounts. I'm going to continue to support the efforts of this agency in my next landing spot, and I look forward to finding ways to help you in the work that you're doing. I have tremendous confidence in the four of you. I'm really looking forward to today's actions. You have some heavy items on this agenda, and I'm very confident in the work that you're about to do. So thank you for this recognition. I really appreciate it. You didn't have to do it, and it's I see it as a real strong sign of friendship from all four of you. So thank you.
Thank you. Item 2 is a consent agenda. Anyone wish to remove any items from the consent agenda?
Second.
All in favor?
Aye.
Motion carries unanimously. Item 3, Eric, if you care
Yes.
to go forward with an update.
Okay, well, good afternoon. And I'll keep this brief. There's a number of items on our agenda that are going to take some time, and I'll keep our update brief. But the last month has been we've spent considerable time obviously making progress on addressing the key issues that I've identified previously. And I've highlighted in color a couple of the items that we're going to be bringing before you today as agenda items to discuss in a little bit more detail. And that is with regard to our delivery methods, our recommendation for a delivery method, as well as an update on the need for funding and financing and when those needs occur and what steps are needed to take place in order to have sufficient funding at the time to meet our schedule. But other than that, we've made some other progress relative to water rights. We have confirmed, my last board meeting I mentioned that it was going to be January 18th, and I was corrected that was tentative. We've been told now that it will occur on January 18th, the last protest hearing before the State Water Resources Control Board. Again, that's a protest filed by the California Sport Fishing Protection Alliance. And that's our last of 11 protests that we need to address prior to our being in receipt of a permit. So we're looking forward to that. We're engaged continuously in working with RD 2035 and the Conway Preservation Group in terms of working together on joint intake activities. We're also looking into summer water transfers as well. We're pretty confident in our facility alignments. We've initiated some final permitting steps with the Corps of Engineers and continuing that with the 404 activities, which have included the development of a wetlands delineation that has been submitted to the Corps of Engineers, which is a key first step toward obtaining our 404. We are waiting for comments back from UC Davis. Draft contract agreement has been sent to them. They have been reviewing it, and we expect comments back within a week or two relative to their participation with the agency. So a number of things have taken place. I'd like to highlight, for those of you who haven't seen this, I think a couple of you haven't, this is a view from the intake. Since a lot of our work has been associated with the intake and we want to try to resolve the site selection, this is a view from the RD 2035 site, just to give you a perspective. It's just north of the I-5 Interstate 5 bridge over the Sacramento River. And this is what their current intake looks like. This was established, I believe, in 1919. We've had a chance to tour that this past week, and it's pretty fascinating. They're talking about it as a historic monument, actually. But this is the existing pumping facility for RD 2035, for which a fish screen is being required. Okay. We talked about last time about consideration of two sites, Plan A and Plan B, and I just wanted to give you a perspective. I don't think I showed this to you last meeting. We're still continuing our work on Plan B, particularly with regard to the environmental work where we need to have supplemental environmental impact report done on that site. Since we're not, at this point in time, there's a number of issues that are up in the air with the Plan A site, which is the RD 2035 site. But I just wanted to give you that perspective of those locations. When you hear us talk about Plan A and Plan B, that's what we're talking about. And that's taken a lot of our time during this past month. Okay. We still are adhering to our schedule. We're not making any changes to the schedule. We still plan on being operational in 2016. Much of the preliminary engineering work still we're on target to finish that in the first quarter, by the end of the first quarter of next year, 2011. So that's still on target. We have not made any changes to our activities in terms of the scheduling. Okay. I know of interest to you in the past has been what we're doing with regard to public outreach. I just wanted to include this overhead just for informational purposes so you can see who we have talked with and who we're planning to talk with in the coming month. And again, we're open to any suggestions that you have as to who we should be talking with. Our goal is to get out and get the word out how great this project is and how important it is, and to let people have the opportunity to ask any questions that they may have. And okay. I let the cat out of the bag right there. But also in front of you, from Public Outreach, there's a draft of a document we're distributing for funding that we put together to let people know what we're about and how important this project is, and that if funding becomes available, we're in a position to secure it. Now, the surprise. Go ahead.
I don't know where it's going to turn to.
No, go back. There. But I wanted to conclude my update with acknowledging Dick Donnelly. Is he here today? Yes. Stand up, Dick. Support of me particularly, and his enthusiasm and all his ideas that he's brought to the table on behalf of not only us, but Woodland particularly, and the JPA. So we really appreciate it. I'm going to miss you a lot and really appreciate your support. And thanks. I wish you had dressed better for our partnering. And that concludes my update. I told you it was going to be very quick, so.
I thought you were going to have Dick predict the winner of the game. All right, thank you. Any questions from the board on that item?
I just wanted to say, at the last meeting I raised some questions about the public outreach, and I just wanted to thank Kim for getting together with me and showing me the plan, and I really was quite impressed at the scope of outreach that's going on, and I think it is, particularly important because we're doing an awful lot of work here. We're doing an awful lot of good work here, but it's going to probably hit the greater community maybe faster than they expect. So, appreciation to you and Kim and the whole team for kind of continuing to think about that. But it looks like the people we're checking in with are exactly the right communities, and we're doing it exactly the right way. And we've got a brochure coming out, I think, too,
yes.
that's
Right,
ahead of the
and
curve
that's in
there.
the works, too, as I noted on that slide. But
Great.
Very good. Are we moving on to item 4 then?
Actually, before I forget, one more thing. Eric, for the January 18 State Water Resources Control Board
Yes.
hearing on the CalSPA complaint, do you recommend that we, consider attending that, or is that kind of a staff function?
I'm going to rely on our attorney
Yeah.
for the guidance on that.
Any of you who can attend the hearing would be very helpful and appreciated. Whether or not you'll actually testify
remains to be seen. We're putting together our case presentation. What we definitely will have will be some policy statements from key folks offhand, or preliminarily, at least maybe one from a Woodland representative, one from a Davis representative, maybe one from somebody from the county of Yolo, and we will be putting together those policy statements as part of a written package that goes to the board, who actually we recommend for oral testimony remains to be seen. But certainly being there in support of the project, if you're available, would be helpful.
Great. And I would say if it's going to make a difference for those policy statements to be approved by our respective councils, get them to us and we'll get them on. I don't know if that is persuasive and helps, or it's window dressing that's superfluous, but either way, yeah.
Very good.
Good. Eric, are you going to take item 4?
Yeah, item 4, I'll lead into that item 4. Item 4 is what I considered one of our key issues, and that obviously is to make sure we have financing in place when we need it, and it's intricately tied to the schedule. So I've asked our program manager, I've asked our financial staffs of both City of Davis and obviously headed up by Paul Navazio, who's our treasurer, to develop a plan, a conceptual plan as to when we need the money and how much we need, and then how we're going to secure it, and what steps do we need to take in advance of having that money available when we need it. And so I'm going to turn over the presentation to Paul.
Thank you, Eric. So this, first and foremost, is an informational update, and really the intent is to put before the board and the project team and the public the interrelationship, if you will, between moving the project forward from an engineering, permitting, planning standpoint, and, as Eric said, the funding requirements in order to bring the project to fruition. There's a lot of work, obviously, to be done, and it's going to happen over an extended period of time, but it's going to be important to highlight, if there's 2 takeaways from this: the need to coordinate the efforts of the JPA and the project team with efforts of the member agencies, City of Davis, City of Woodland, and frankly the University of California, so that the financing and funding efforts are going on parallel paths in support of the project. The second takeaway from this is simply going to be that there is, because of the fact that we are, public agencies, this is a water utility funded project, there is a significant lead time between the process by which the member agencies establish the rates and can secure the revenue stream that's needed to do the financing and do the funding in support of the work that needs to be done. So going forward, not only is the coordination going to be important, but recognizing some of the lead times that, and I hope to highlight that really for illustrative purposes so that it's on all of our radar, the critical importance of this coordinated effort. We're going to cover very briefly the overall project budget and cash flow requirements. That is obviously the basis for developing the financing plan and the funding requirements. We have already begun and will continue to evaluate a number of financing options, and we'll discuss those briefly. And then, as I said, both the need for the coordination with primarily with the 2 cities as it relates to both the timing for authorizing or issuance of debt financing, and well in advance of that, the rate setting process that's a prerequisite to our ability to provide the debt. This presentation of the project budget and cash flow is identical to the one that the board saw back in May, June, when you adopted the budget for this fiscal year. I will say that internally within the project team, the project budget, and probably more importantly, the cash flow, i.e. the timing of the major expenditures, remains and will remain somewhat in flux. The board has been discussing and will continue to discuss several issues that will actually impact the overall project budget and the timing. the general manager in his earlier presentation pointed to the scenarios of a Plan A or a Plan B. Those have different budgetary and cost implications. One of the items on your agenda after this is a discussion of delivery methods, and the choice of delivery method will also impact not only potentially the overall project costs, but probably more importantly, the timing of when some significant project costs and when significant commitment of expenditures are going to be needed. And so at this point, the point is merely that the financing team and the project team have been and need to continue to work very closely together so that the financing plan mirrors and evolves and can support the project as it moves forward, pending some of the decisions that the board still has before them. This chart is one that we're continuing to work on. Again, I want to highlight that this is really for illustrative purposes, but one of the main reasons why it's important to develop an effective financing plan and also a flexible financing plan is that what's very important, both I know to this agency, but also to the two member agencies and the respective city councils and the public, is the impact on the water utility rates of this project. And so in the recent past, both cities in establishing their current water utility rates have done projections, and we will continue to update projections of out-year utility rates. And as you'll see in a slide later, we're not only looking to manage the overall project and project costs and delivery, but also do so in a way where we're able to manage as best we can the rate impacts of the particular project. And the impact on the rates makes it all the more imperative that both the project overall and the financing is done in the most cost-effective and prudent way possible. Two things that I would also note on this slide, and we've had some discussions within the project team, and it really delves into a little bit in the public outreach and the public discussion when we're out talking to the public about rate impacts. You know, clearly the big focus is on, and I think there's a growing awareness on the extent to which water rates under pretty much any scenario for the two jurisdictions are going to be increasing. And I think there's a growing awareness of the, the benefits of the project and the, very good arguments for, in support of the project and the rate increases. A couple of things that we're going to probably want to sharpen our pencils on, both in the financing but also in the public outreach, are two things. One is we've been focusing a lot, and I know our city council and our public does, on where the rates are today compared to where they're projected to go in support of this project. And one of the things that we put on this chart, and it's just really a placeholder, is the fact that water rates under any scenario are not going to be static in perpetuity, and water rates are going to need to increase over time, even absent this project. And so going forward, we think it would be beneficial to not so much compare where rates are today to where they might be at project build-out, but where the rates would be in 2019 and 2020 without the project in comparison to the project. And frankly, a lot of the increase, or I wouldn't say a lot of it, but a significant portion of the increase is really attributable to ongoing costs of operation and maintenance of our existing water infrastructure and water utilities. And so, effectively, the incremental cost of the project is not the entire difference between current rates and future rates. The other point to highlight, and maybe we have to, again, integrate into this method, into this message, is that absent the surface water project, at least on the City of Davis side, and I presume also on the City of Woodland side, we would have to come up with alternatives to address some of our both water and wastewater utilities. In other words, there's additional costs that we would be incurring to improve the quality of our water absent pursuing the surface water project. And so the cost of the alternative to this project is also something that we want to begin to include in our message, The point being is that we believe that the project that we're pursuing is actually the most cost-effective means of improving our water quality, achieving a reliable water supply. The not pursuing the project may not be an option for either community. And so those are some of the messages that we want to build in going forward. And so we can talk some more about that. In terms of the funding requirements and the financing plan, what I'd like to communicate is that there's really kind of the short-term funding and financing needs of the agency and the project, and then the longer term. Currently, we're in the phase of the, the permitting, additional studies, environmental, engineering, and otherwise, and then moving into the preliminary design. That should is the major costs through this fiscal year and next fiscal year, and both the cities of Davis and the city of Woodland feel pretty comfortable that we are able to fund and continue to fund the efforts of the JPA through the next maybe 24, 30 months, essentially with revenues supported by the existing water rates. The city of Woodland last year approved a multi-year rate ordinance for their water utility, which essentially established their rates through fiscal year 12-13, and included in that rate analysis and in their financing plan would be sufficient resources to support the work of the JPA, and with that they are in the process of securing themselves either a line of credit or commercial paper or other short-term bridge financing to get from now through when we're going to need to issue additional debt financing for the larger project. The City of Davis to this point has been approving water utility rates on an annual basis, the most recent one for this fiscal year, but we established the rates we feel sufficient to support the securing of a line of credit that will cover the cash flow requirements for the JPA's activity through fiscal year 11 and 12. Longer term, when we get into the construction phase of the project, or as you'll discuss a little bit later, if the decision is to pursue a design build, that's the time frame when we will be needing to access a significant infusion of funding currently projected in fiscal year 12-13. Again, the actual timing of the need for the major financing component for this project will depend somewhat on the choice of the delivery methods. The primary funding source continues that we're anticipating needing continues to be utility revenue bonds, and these will be bonds that will be issued backed by the water rates of the member agencies. However, we've had discussion previously and continue that we're also anticipating pursuing aggressively other outside funding sources, be they grants at the federal level, state level. There may be opportunities for some other loans or financing that will reduce the amount of the overall debt financing, but that's needed, and that will be our goal if they're cost effective and appropriate. But we believe at this point that the major funding that we're going to need for the construction of the project will come through the issuance of utility revenue bonds. So with the bond financing expected, again, to be the primary funding, there will be some issues that we will be looking at. Well, we're looking at them, some decisions that are still a ways off that we're going to need to make as we approach debt financing. And just to give you an idea of some of them, there may be some different approaches to how we structure the financing depending on whether or not we're aiming to essentially manage to the total project costs, i.e. the lowest interest and the lowest debt service over the life of the project. That would be the way to reduce the overall project costs. However, because we're also keeping a keen eye on utility rate impacts, efforts that we will look at and options that we will have to mitigate some of the rate impacts, essentially spread them over time, may suggest pursuing some debt financing that, on a net present value basis, pardon the jargon, but it may be a little bit more expensive over the long haul, but would allow us more flexibility in how we structure the rates and how we structure the debt. So those are some trade-offs that we're going to, this is the equivalent or the analogy when you're buying a house. You can either pay cash up front, or you can get a 30-year loan or even longer and spread it over a longer period of time if that's deemed more affordable, even though in the long run it could be shown to potentially cost some more money. The other thing that's of critical importance is that while we're focusing here on the part of the surface water project that the JPA is responsible for, in other words, the intake, the water treatment, and the pipeline and distribution, there are also significant elements to this project that are essentially the local facilities that both Woodland and Davis are going to need to upgrade and put in place in support of this project. So as we look at the financing and the financing options and the rate impacts, we also have to meld that at the city level with the needs of our local facilities. And so that's why it's going to be another reason of importance to coordinate and integrate the financing of the JPA's portion of the project with the financing of the local city's portion of the projects. Some of the other financing considerations as we approach the debt issue, I think we had some brief conversations several months ago, but it's still unclear at the end of the day whether or not it will be advantageous for the JPA itself to issue the bond financing. There are potentially some advantages to that approach. Alternatively, it may prove advantageous or beneficial, at least from the perspective of the two cities, for the cities to be the issuing party for the bonds, and essentially then just provide the JPA with the funding based on the cash flow needs to move the project forward. Again, this is with an eye towards incorporating the local facility, and then, you know, in theory, or it's possible hypothetically that the two primary agencies, Davis and Woodland, may have some different approaches to how they want to manage the debt and the debt structure, which might suggest each agency looking at the debt from their perspective. So again, there's pros and cons to each of these alternatives. We'll be looking at them, regardless of which approach we take on the issuance of the debt. Very close coordination with the cities is going to be needed. Again, the major funding commitments for either the design or design, build, and construction of the project could be needed as early as fiscal year 12-13, and that would suggest an earlier bond issuance. And before either the JPA or the cities issue bonds, there's going to need to be city council authorization on from both cities prior to being able to issue the debt. And sort of fast forwarding through the remaining slides, there's also a significant lead time between when we're going to need to issue the debt, when the two city councils are going to need to authorize said debt, and the rate setting process that puts the rates in place that will be needed for that. And so that's why, as Eric has said consistently, schedule is the most important thing. That's also true on the financing, and we need to mesh and mirror these processes. So the timing again will be tied to the project cash flows. Because of the process that the cities have to go through in order to establish the rates sufficient to meet the cash flow needs, we have some flexibility, but it's limited. We can't just throw a Prop 218 rate process in motion without sufficient advance planning and forethought, nor would it be advantageous to us to do so. So we'll probably have about 9 or 10 months of lead time. The other factor that comes into play when we look at the lead time for the rate setting process in support of it is the trade-off between, if we go through the rate setting process and both cities look at another round of more likely than not multi-year rate setting, and we are before the public in our jurisdictions and moving forward with these rate increase, we want to be darn sure that the rates that we're asking the councils to set and the voters to implicitly approve are sufficient to cover the costs that we have for the project. And because of the lead time on a project of this scale, until you're well into the preliminary design, or in a perfect world, we would have the bids in hand, we would know what the costs are, and then we would set the rates and the financing. And so there's going to be some trade-offs between the managing that lead time and having certainty of what it is that we're going to ultimately need the financing and the rates to support. That will be one of the major challenges going forward in our rate-setting process. This chart may be hard to read for members of the audience in the small print, even for the board members up on the dais, but this is, again, just for illustrative purposes to show that typically there's about a 10-month lead time in establishing our utility rates. So we are just now beginning the process that is going to lead to the rates that each city is going to be setting, well, at least in the case of the City of Davis. Again, Woodland has already established some multi-year rates. But for the City of Davis, the rates that will take effect in fiscal year 11-12, we're starting that process here sort of momentarily between the analysis, the rate setting. We have a fair amount of public review and input into the rates even before we issue our Prop 218 notices, but the schedule typically calls for the council to approve and authorize rates in late May, early June that take effect in July or August of the coming fiscal year. And so what we're going to need to be doing is meshing or overlaying the project schedule, the awards of major contracts, and the financing schedule to the rate setting schedule to ensure that we either are already in sync in terms of having rates in this scenario set for the 12-13 fiscal year. We will start that process in the fall of 2011. That's a year from now. Yet we may not have all the information that we would ideally like to have at that point. So that's one challenge. If the schedule suggests that we will be needing to issue debt or put the financing plan together sooner than, at least in the City of Davis's case, we may look at having to shift the sort of the schedule or the timing for how we look at the rates and set the rates. There's nothing magic about adopting them in May or June. There's nothing magic about them taking effect July or August. We've typically tried to synchronize those with our fiscal year budget. Moving into this phase of this project, more likely than not, we're going to need to synchronize the rate setting and the 218 process to when the timing needs for the project dictate, so that we're not either too far ahead. Certainly we can't be behind the needs of the project. So that's the kind of the main takeaway from this. In terms of the efforts of the financing team to date, we do have sort of the financing team coming together primarily with the two city finance departments and respective fiscal advisors. The org charts that the general manager has shared previously show the funding component also within the JPA structure. At this point, we anticipate the JPA sort of funding team to be taking the lead on aggressively pursuing outside funding and making sure that all the funding opportunities that present themselves we're in the running for, so to speak. Frankly, the two city finance departments and the fiscal advisors will probably be focusing primarily on the structure and the template, if you will, for the debt financing that it will be needed, and the size of which, again, will depend on our success in securing some of the outside fundings. We've just recently begun kind of a more formal process where we're meeting now on a bi-weekly basis, both to get updated on the project costs and the schedules, continue to work on the general template for the debt financing, and already and hence the need for this presentation, identifying those areas where we're going to need to then coordinate this effort with the two cities' ability to set the rates and have the revenue stream in place in support of the project. So we're going to continue on parallel paths, and we think with good planning and good coordination, the funding and financing for the project the plan is for it to be clearly in hand as we move forward with some of your major decisions and commitments of funds in support of the project. And that concludes the overview of the budget funding.
Thanks, Paul.
Marty, why don't you ask your questions first?
Great, thank you. Just a few, if you wouldn't mind. The numbers that you gave us on the second page, the budget cash flow, I know that you said there's some flexibility in those depending on how the system delivery is and also whether we go with option A or B for the intake facility. Are these a ceiling or floor in your best guess?
I'm not sure that these are either the ceiling or the floor. I think this, again, these numbers come from the budget and cash flow projections that went into essentially the establishment of this year's budget. And we also have updated information since then. So my understanding, if I could answer your question more directly, is that this still would assume a Plan A scenario. And I'm not quite sure at the time that this was done if there was any assumptions about, design build versus a traditional design and construction. At the time that this was developed, there was sort of a floor and a ceiling that bracketed these. I think this is still overall about $330 million. I think generally speaking, we're still in that same range. What will be affected probably more than anything else is the timing on when the major cash flows and the commitment of those cash flows are going to, and I also was remiss in saying that at your January board meeting, you'll be getting a mid-year fiscal update, and I think we would be able to probably be appropriate to update the overall project budget and overall cash flow when we come back at your January board meeting.
So overall project costs could be more, but your guess is it would be less?
Well, I think if everything goes according to how we hope, there are scenarios where the project will, come in favorable.
Okay.
Having said that, with all of the unknowns, I mean, we're still waiting for the permit. We still have to we have issues with the intake. So hopefully in the next several months there'll be more clarity, but we can't wait until we absolutely have the final answers to get started on the planning.
Understood. On your chart on the projected rate impacts,
Yep.
it looks like today we're going from about $35 a month to 2019 of about $90 to $95 a month, depending on city.
Yep.
And you said that the project's not 100% of that. Do you have any idea what what increment of that is due to the project?
That's a good question. And I might ask other staff members if I miss. One thing I would note is that the rate impacts that City of Davis and I believe City of Woodland has done, these projections include, this is just the overall rates for not only support of the project, but also in support of the local facilities and the operations and maintenance. So this is not entirely just the component of the surface water project. I mean, if you're asking how much of the rate increase is attributable to the surface water project specifically, I think it's going to vary from jurisdiction to jurisdiction. The other point that I tried to make is that the water rates, just assuming a 3 to 5% a year annual inflator, are going to end up in the $55 to $60 range, even absent the surface water project.
Okay.
And so my point here is that the cost of the overall project and the local facilities is probably closer to $30 a month per household than it is the $70 that one could infer from just comparing current rates to where rates may need to go. But clearly we need to flesh that out and highlight those distinctions.
Well, I think so, because I think if you saw this just flat out without explanation and assumed it was all the project, it would be pretty startling. In the 2013, or the 12-13, the major amount of money, it looks like about 300 million. I'm just adding up the three columns in my head. Would you bond that whole amount, or would you break it up over 2 or 3 different bonding cycles?
Actually, that's a great point. I think two things. First of all, we're only going to bond to the extent that we need to. So to the extent that we're successful in either grant funding or outside funding, then the bonding will be sized accordingly. But in terms of the actual debt issuance, the way I envision this, and it may change, is that we will probably seek one, for each city and each city council, you'll probably be asked to authorize one overall authorization for the overall debt issue, but we will issue the bonds essentially in series. So it really
Okay.
depends on the timing of it, but we would not come to the council each year with a request for additional bond authorization and rates. You could
So you
do
get an
that
overall
once,
authorization.
you get it over with, and then we will issue the bonds based on the cash flow needs of the project.
Okay, and last question. They're then issuing the bonds, and then there's payments over some period of time, and that's funding the capital. After that's paid for, do the rates drop back? And somehow I don't think they do, because don't we have to have a fund for replacement?
Right, actually what you're alluding to there is once the project is online and running, a lot of this turns into your operation and maintenance. So that either the debt service that each of the city or the JPA will incur to amortize the debt will essentially be part of your operating expenses, and then clearly there's going to be the need to build into your operating budget, and therefore the rates that are charged to the agencies, an element of replacement fund, reserve funds, and the like. And so those will be things that will be discussed and would probably show up in your operations and maintenance. Right now, we're focusing on the cost to get the project to build out and online. But we're also, with the project team, is working on the overall operation and maintenance budget to cover the needs.
Great, thank you. Thank you, Mr. Chair.
All right. Vice Chair Souza.
Thank you. Marty asked a couple questions I wanted to, and so thank you. I don't have to repeat them. But to play off of one of your questions about the ceiling or the floor, within those estimates, did you take into consideration the contracting method? And the contracting method, which we have before us later tonight, or actually this afternoon, has a potential savings. And estimates are in the staff report, could be up to 20%. That makes a difference on such a large project. So was that in the consideration of the estimates?
Board Member Souza, I think it's sort of a timing issue here, because I think the way, again, this is really just to illustrate both the magnitude, the timing, and again, the need for this coordination. But if I could try to answer your question this way, there's still a fairly wide floor and ceiling depending on some of these variables, and as we look at the individual issues and questions, the gap between the floor and the ceiling is going to kind of come into focus. And so it's as we make those decisions and make those determinations, we will be needing to update the project estimate. So again, I'm not sure I can tell you with certainty what all the assumptions were that went into this, but it's sort of the midpoint of our estimates. This is less intended, again, to give you an update on what the overall project costs are, but to highlight the timing and the considerations.
And I realize that we have time before fiscal year 12-13 comes about. The second question has to do with the handout that we have and getting it into the cap-to-cap priority project list and pursuing that vigorously so that a potential of $78 million is not just a dream, but we're actively working towards that reality. So have we approached the SAC Metro and begun to lobby to have this as a priority project for the region?
I can answer that. We have not done that, but that's a good idea. I know Jacques Debray has been putting a lot of time into assessing our opportunities for federal and state funding, and is very familiar with the process, working through Yolo County Water Resources Association, through the IRWMP process, which we're rated top priority for that process. We're exploring all opportunities. We've submitted applications for SRF, State Revolving Fund funding, low-interest loans. So we're looking at all those opportunities, but I'm anxious to hear any suggestion you may have. Who should we be talking with? And we'll take any guidance we can get. So.
Well, I know two of our board members were members of the water team in the last cap to cap, and I would hope that they would pursue that again, and that we pursue having somebody part of that cap to cap, particularly if we lobby vigorously to get it as a priority project on that team and in that effort, which has always yielded very positive results in our region.
We've been making contacts with the elected officials, as noted on that public outreach efforts, and that's one of our intent, is to get our project before key elected officials as well, both state and federal.
Mm-hmm. And then the second question has to do with the finance team and the bond path that we may pursue. And by that I mean whether it's the JPA bond path or a city's bond path. Is there an estimation of when we're going to determine the path from that team?
Yeah, I'm not sure I have a good answer to that, other than to say that that decision will need to be made, obviously well in advance of sort of the issuance. I'm not sure that the process leading up to the bond issuance, though, will be that different in terms of the rate requirements, the actions that are needed by the council, but then it's, putting together the bond documents and the bonding authority. But we are already beginning the process of evaluating what the pros and cons might be, and those are probably also some discussions that we're going to want to have with the respective city councils. So part of the purpose of this meeting is to sort of put on all of our radar the need to have some of these conversations with our respective councils, and then kind of bring the collective best thinking forward as a recommendation.
And I ask that because it would be good to see the supporting documentation that shows those pros and cons in financial terms. Thank you.
Yes.
And there we go. Maybe this will help answer, since two of you spoke to it. The estimate you have up there that Paul included in his charts is really the project team's current best probable cost of the project. And as you certainly can imagine, there are literally thousands of issues that we'll be working through over the next few years that will affect price. One of them's the contracting method. Many of those things, as we refine them, will allow us to save money. Some of them may cost us more. We're always striving for the most cost-effective approach, but we have not presumed to incorporate into our estimate any potential savings due to the contracting method, because you haven't taken an action on it, frankly, so we're not trying to be presumptuous. We're hopeful that number is a little towards the conservative end of the range that Paul referred to, but the fact is we're trying not to play around with the big number this early in the process, because there's so many things that will affect it. We don't want the public to see 20 different numbers that are just marginally different. So maybe that helps answer your question a little bit better.
And there's one other point, and that is the procurement method. We all want to lock in a number, and we want to be able to see it. One of the advantages of the different procurement methods is, when do you find out what the cost is going to be? One method, and you'll be hearing this tonight, one method, we're going to get the cost up front. We're going to know at the beginning what it's going to cost us through the end, whereas another method may still leave it open to the bidding environment, the material costs, and those things for several more years. So that'll be part of the decision you'll be looking at tonight.
Chair. I guess for me, I always like to see the numbers lower because I know we have a lot of folks in this room here that are looking at those numbers, and I don't want to lead them down a road or to make them think that this is the upper end. I'd prefer that it is, as you are doing, it is the engineer's best guess at the estimated cost at this point in time.
Yeah, I'd like to point out that over the past year and a half, this number's come down $40 million. We are actively pursuing every method we can to reduce these costs.
Thank you.
Director Cravosa?
Just quickly, maybe for Paul or for Eric, on the projected rate impacts chart, of course, the light blue line is the spooky, scary one, and that's the average rate of the next best alternative. I'm new here, but next best alternative, those numbers are generated from a previous EIR, or how documented is that line?
In developing the recommended plan, a number of alternatives were addressed, those which would be feasible in terms of meeting the needs of the project. And the only other alternative that would meet the needs of the project are to incorporate reverse osmosis into the treatment processes. And that could be used either at the wellheads themselves for all your groundwater, because the issues are TDS, selenium, and boron particularly,
Yeah.
and or to have a centralized treatment facility which we would pump from all the wells to one centralized water treatment plant with reverse osmosis, or you could put reverse osmosis at the tail end of your wastewater treatment plant to treat the effluent prior to discharge, to meet the NPDES permit requirements. That's a very expensive process, both from a capital standpoint and particularly operational standpoint with regard to the power requirements that are required. Plus, you have to deal environmentally with the brine that results from the treatment process, and either piping it a long distance to a receiving water body or trucking it to some
So
location.
it's basically the documented reverse osmosis numbers that
Right, and
we've
that's
got
what
here.
was indicated. It's at least double the cost of the recommended alternative.
Yeah, I mean, you get to 4x over current rates and quicker.
Yeah,
Yeah.
right.
Good, and I think just as information, at least when I've been involved in cap-to-cap in the past, you usually want to be ready kind of early to mid-January. That's when they make their calls for a project. So I think it's none too soon, and it looks like our federal funding sheet that we've got up here is starting to queue us up for that. But as long as we've got that ready to go, that may start happening before our next meeting, would be my guess.
We'll report on that next meeting then.
Great.
Yeah, in fact, we've learned with flood, with the flood proposals that we've submitted that January's too late. You have to have something that you've orchestrated through Senator Feinstein's office or Senator Boxer's office, and as well as Congressman Thompson and Herger's office ahead of cap-to-cap. Cap-to-cap won't put something like this on the list unless it's authorized project somehow.
Okay.
So.
So we need to capture Mr. Thompson when
Yeah.
he's in town.
Yeah, the question always is, what's your ask and what's your justification for the ask? And I think we have both we have justification on multiple fronts. We ought, but we need to have a definite ask. When I was back in Washington last
March,
I think it was, and in the EPA office, bringing up the way that this project tied into EPA requirements, because I mean it takes you 10 minutes to explain it to somebody, but obviously there's a nexus there, and we need to clearly have. They wanted to know, well, what's your ask? What are you asking for? And we don't have a clear ask, and at least we didn't at that point. And so this is the clearest ask I've seen so far, $78 million ask. And I think if we can develop those specifics, that would be very helpful.
Okay, good.
Also, I don't know if you might want to check with the congressional offices if there's going to be a WRDA bill this year. 'Cause I don't think there was one
Yeah,
last year.
and I don't know if we'll get word authorization for this. Somehow, we certainly need to go that route. And those are things you guys are all much more familiar with than we are. But in principle, ratepayers expect us to do everything humanly possible to get help for the project. And I think, I believe it's justified from my opinion, from an ethical standpoint. We're being mandated to go this route. It's not like we're just doing it because we like to get river water.
Could I ask one other question? Just one thing I forgot, and actually your questions reminded me of it. In the technical memo, you talked about private activity bonds, which were tax-free private investment bonds. And you said that there's a cap at the state level, but there's apparently an amount that is available for those. I wondered if you knew what that was.
Yeah, I'm not sure I have an answer for you on that.
Okay.
We'll
Okay, I've got just a couple questions. The first one is, Woodland has been winning the game on the rate, and we flip-flop in 2014, and I'm trying to figure out why we suddenly start losing the contest here.
Part of that is our internal local costs go up above Davis's, and we have some larger infrastructure to install.
So is it deferred infrastructure
Yes.
mostly? Okay. And 218 process, I've got a question there in terms of, Woodland has had a 218 process when we raised our rates through the year 2013. That's done and over with. You're talking about a 218 process next year here. Is that for Davis that you're referring to? Is there some 218 process this agency will have to go through in the event that we do the bonding as an agency? Just help me there.
Yeah, it's a good question. To my knowledge, and we'll double check this, is that really the 218 process rests squarely with the agencies who are establishing the rates and collecting the rates. And so the decision to either issue bonds through the JPA or the cities will really be actually more of a technical, almost
So
a legal
irrelevant
issue.
to the 218 process.
It's irrelevant. So the 218 process, I mean, Davis is going to be going through it again. The question for us is going to be, how soon do we need to move into a multi-year Prop 218 and rate setting? Do we have the ability to wait until our 12-13 rates, or do we need to start doing
Okay.
that sooner? I think the issue for Woodland, depending again on the timing, is I think the assumption when Woodland, and I can't speak for the Woodland staff, but my sense is that the assumption when you adopted your multi-year rates through 12-13 is that the following rate process would be the one that would be targeting the financing needs for this project. So any scenario where there's a need to accelerate the
Project funding.
the project or the funding, Woodland could be looking at a scenario where a rate-setting process for the next multi-year ends up happening sooner than may have been anticipated.
Okay, so it could be advanced.
Hence the coordination of the two.
Very good. Thank you. Appreciate that analysis. And I think to put it in a nutshell, if I'm understanding correctly, we are deferring a decision about whether the JPA would be the source of funding or the individual cities, pending on whatever looks like it'll work the best in terms of saving ratepayers some money. Is that right?
And gives us the best flexibility, absolutely, yep.
Okay. Very good. Let's move on then to item 5, which is considering selection of a contracting method.
Yes. Item 4 was really for discussion and to give you a heads up as the requirements that you're going to be confronted with as the project progresses. Item 5, we're coming to you with the results of a lot of study and evaluation and a recommendation to you for your approval relative to alternative delivery method to be applied to this project. And as I say all the time, schedule is really the key to implementing any program of this magnitude, and coming up with a reasonable schedule and one that you absolutely adhere to throughout the whole duration of the program. But a key element in establishing that is what delivery method or implementation method are you going to follow in order for you to establish what the key steps are in the implementation. And this has been recognized by your staff and the program manager for the last, before the agency was even formed. And then as the agency was formed, a committee was formally structured, the Facilities Procurement Committee, to really look at the various alternatives from not only an engineering standpoint, a construction standpoint, operational standpoint, but also from a legal standpoint. And what's going to be presented to you today and is in your packet are the results of that study. This is a key decision and will really allow us to really set a firmer schedule and really identify better the cost, as we just learned in the previous agenda item, Jim. Again, like I mentioned, this is a key decision, and the Facilities Procurement Committee was formed really to study the various methods that would be available and to implement the actual method itself through the procurement process, and to select the appropriate team that would help us implement the program, as well as to negotiate the contract and then to direct or actually manage and oversee their work. And the committee that was formed, many of which have been intact since the inception, actually, of the agency, are staff of the JPA, myself, Jim Yost, our project engineer, and Dick Shanahan. The cities were fully involved through Dick Donnelly and Diane Phillips. And then we had consultants who've been very experienced in looking at various delivery methods, and particularly Jerry Gilbert, who's with us here today, as well as Rhodes Trussell. And then from a legal standpoint, we secured, the agency secured the services of Eric Peterson, who's with Hawkins, Delafield, and Wood, who is Eric Peterson's a noted attorney relative to delivery methods, and provide us invaluable guidance. The methods that have been considered are shown here. Traditionally, it's design, build, bid, build, then design, build, CM at risk, design, build, and operate, and then design, build, operate, and finance. And with that introduction, I'd like to have Jim Yost give you further information, as well as Dick Shanahan.
Projects have been completed with all of these methods, so we could certainly do that. But as you move down the chart, the collaboration between the designer, the contractor, the operator, and the owner increases, and so that's why we were interested in looking at some of these others. The process that we have followed to get basically everyone on the team educated and to the same point of understanding is that we have had an incredible number of meetings with engineering consultants, construction contractors, and operational service firms. We've had several of these folks make formal presentations. Matter of fact, board member Doty attended one of those presentations. And then we brought in presentations, folks from cities who had successfully implemented these projects and made presentations to the group. We had Seattle, who talked about their 2 successful projects, San Diego County Water Authority and City of Stockton. They were not all exactly the same, and so it was interesting to learn the lessons, hear the lessons they had learned on those projects. As Eric mentioned, we have special legal counsel. He has done probably more projects in the United States than anyone else, and very many of those have been in California. And we also had financial consultants involved in advising us. We actually started this process back in March of 2010, and it's still ongoing. It's been a very open process, and I would say I've been very pleased with the eagerness and the participation by all the folks who are interested in being considered for this project. We established a number of criteria that we have used to basically evaluate the different methods, and the one that stands out to be paramount in everyone's mind is the life cycle cost comparison. Obviously, a very large part of the project cost is in the operation and maintenance, and so we wanted to make sure that whatever process we use, we had that consideration. The cities made it pretty clear early on that they weren't really interested in hiring staff to run this project, and so provision of operational services was a very important part. Sharing of risk varies amongst the different methods, and so we wanted to come up with a method that had appropriate risk sharing. As I mentioned before, the whole team, and I would say everybody working on this project, has worked in a very collaborative manner. We wanted that to extend to the design, construction, and operation of this project. We're interested in considering the ease of implementation. The staff is sitting right here, and obviously we want it to be, we want him to be able to manage this whole effort. The relative risk exposure that the agency would face was very important, and then the ability to optimize treatment processes and system operation. Our recommendation is to procure a DBO contract to deliver and operate the Davis Woodland Water Supply Project. The facilities that we would see included in that would include the water treatment facility, the raw and treated water transmission mains, and then it gets a little more complex. When we get to the intake, incidentally, I forgot to say what I wanted to say at the start, and that's go Giants. My thought about that whole process with the Giants is if that group of overachievers can get in the World Series, we sure ought to be able to implement this project.
Was that a design, build, operate? Is that how they're?
But anyway, when we get to the intake, if we go with a joint intake, that process is already underway. And RD 2035 already has a 30% design completed for their portion of the intake. We would undoubtedly piggyback on that process with them. And the thought would be to have Montgomery Watson working with West Jost to complete the design of a joint intake and then go through a design bid build approach to get the intake constructed. And the element that would go into the DBO contract then would be operation of the intake. If we go with a standalone intake, the door is more open to options that we would consider there. We could certainly do the same design bid build process on a standalone, but it might make a lot more sense to integrate that into a DBO, into an element of the DBO contract. So hopefully within the next 2 or 3 months, we're going to get this issue nailed down and we'll be able to more clearly define what we would want to do there. The reason why we have selected the DBO approach is probably pretty obvious, having listened to our criteria. The paramount one, again, is that it provides this life cycle cost comparison. And somebody asked me if we were going to get value engineering. We're going to be doing a 20% design on the entire project. And somebody asked me if we were going to have value engineering done on that preliminary design. And I'm going to tell you that if we get bids from 3 or 4 teams for the entire project, that's the best value engineering we could get on this project. And so that's the real value, in my mind, of this process. We'll get a competitive bidding on the life cycle cost basis for the concepts they come up with. We expect this to be a very collaborative process, and it'll be collaborative while they're preparing their proposals. They're actually going to have ideas. They're going to meet with us. They're going to say, have you thought about this? We'll bounce ideas off them, all of this in a very confidential format so that they'll have an opportunity to really get innovative and think outside the box. We will define in the contract documents how we will share risk between the agency and the contractor, and there's some real clear standards for that. We will establish performance standards for delivery by the contractor, and then that will be, basically the standard they'll use to set their prices. This does provide a lump sum price, as Greg said earlier in the process. We envision running this operational component for 15 to 20 years, so the agency then would not have to hire staff over that period of time. And, we would likely build provisions into the contract that would say if the agency wanted to take over the project sooner than that, there would be some buyout provisions. Having a DBO handle all of the project provides a single entity responsible for performance and ensures overall project facilities compatibility and long-term operational reliability, and gives us price certainty and lower risk related to some of the other options. Preliminary schedule is to prepare and distribute the RFQ in March of next year. And let me just say over the schedule that I've really simplified this. We'll be back to the board a number of times, I can assure you, during this process. Review submittals and shortlist DBO teams, and then come back to you with board approval on that shortlist and authorization to prepare and distribute the request for proposals. That would be around October of next year. Then there would be about 6 months for the teams to prepare their proposals and about 4 months for the agency team to review those proposals and begin negotiation of draft service contract terms, request the best and final offer, and then select a team and request board approval to negotiate the contract. So we would expect board approval of the contract and notice to proceed sometime in October, November, December of 2012. Another item that we wanted to make very formal, we would like to see a very formal protocol for communications on this project, and we would like all the communications to be directed through either Eric or me. It's not that we have a big ego. The reason we want to do that is we have to establish a very level playing field in this competition. And it will be very important that everybody who competes on this project feels they have an equal chance and have been treated exactly the same as everybody else. So it's very important that they receive the same answers that other people receive, and the best way to do that is to just have the two of us answering those questions. I don't want anyone to assume that we want to shut off communications. What we want to do is channel that communication and keep a very open and collaborative process going. So we would like to have you basically instruct all staff and director inquiries to be referred directly to Eric or me. And then the last thing I wanted to say was this process will really enable the facilities procurement committee to react to input from the industry as we proceed down the line. We're going to find out more. We're going to get more education on their reaction to our proposed approach. We want to be sure we have a process in place where we can react to that. If they have some really good ideas, then we ought to be flexible enough to change our approach to accommodate those. And then Dick Shanahan's going to talk to you a little bit about risk allocation.
Thank you, Jim. And before I do that, I want to talk real briefly just about the question of legal authority, which isn't in our slides, but the agency does have legal authority for this type of alternative procurement method. We're relying on a special provision in the California Government Code for fee-producing projects, and your water project classically fits within the authority provided by the Government Code, so it's a little bit different than approaches you may be used to, but it is authorized. Risk management, risk allocation is a big reason supporting a DBO approach under these facts, and I'll just walk through each of those. Some of these risks are on the agency, some are going to be on the contractor, and using a DBO approach is advantageous, as I will explain. First of all, as to the financing and the rate setting, that obviously is on the agency as the owner. You will commit to a DBO contract, and that will financially obligate you to that contract, and that commitment, again, will come through the rates, as Mr. Navazio outlined earlier in our meeting. Secondly, under all the various contracting approaches, it's going to be incumbent upon the agency to provide the land and rights of way, and We are in the process of doing that, and that will be an effort that will be ongoing with the agency, both for the intake, the transmission pipelines, as well as the treatment plant site. Permitting is where things start to, you can start to have some advantages, because some of the initial core permits, especially some of the more troublesome environmental permits, will be on the agency, and we want to be in control of the acquisition of those permits. But part of this process will clearly delineate and define the DBO contracting team's responsibility to identify, apply for and obtain various project permits. So there will be a clear allocation of risk in the contract documents that will come before you. This is our responsibility. This is going to be on the DBO contractor. The next three elements, design, construction, and operation, that's probably the biggest advantage, in my view, of using the DBO contractor's approach, is you're able to take all three of those key project elements and move them into a single project contract with a single contract responsibility to handle all three of those elements. And the process allows the agency, the alternative approach we're using is still a competitive approach, and it will allow us to have competitive bids, but the bids will be evaluated unlike the traditional approach you may be used to. It'll be evaluated based on this life cycle contract approach, incorporating all of these various elements. And I'd like to contrast these three, design, construction, and operation, against the more traditional contracting approach that you may be familiar with in your cities for your utility and streets and other projects, and that is the city hires an engineer to do the design, then you take that design and you go out to bid and select the contractor to build the facility based on that design, and then typically then the operation would be by the city, whatever the utility or the street project was. And then with all three of those, then you have three sets of contracts or three lines of responsibility, and it sets to a situation that you may have come across with your cities where you've got various contractors pointing at each other in terms of responsibility. By using a DBO approach, we're able to put that all under a single line of responsibility, which can be very advantageous. As to operation, also, it's significant that for this particular agency, as you know, you're new, you have no staff, you have no employees, and a DBO approach really is a good opportunity here, because it allows you, at least in the initial term with this project, to provide for the operation through the DBO contractor approach, and then thereafter, as the agency grows and matures, you can then, after the DBO contract expires, decide how you want to handle operation moving forward in the future. Raw water quality is primarily going to be, in all cases, a risk taken by the agency. You will be taking water out of the Sacramento River, and we can't expect the contractor to do anything to assure the quality of that water. But as to the next one, it's very helpful, because the contract documents will have performance standards that will obligate the contractor to not only design facilities to meet your treatment standards, but operationally, if you fold in the O part of the DBO, then operationally it obligates the contractor to meet certain water quality parameters, not only through construction, but also through operation. And then finally, changes in law, that's always a risk as we move forward, especially in water quality arenas, the standards. It is somewhat of a changing playing field, and those risks generally are going to be on the agency, because it's difficult to predict those risks and difficult to pass those on to a contractor. Finally, in terms of the staff recommendation in the agenda report prepared by Mr. Mishi that's in your agenda packet, on page 1 is the recommendation from staff. And with that, I pause to see if you have any questions of any of us.
Joe, any questions?
Sure. I take it that this, thinking about Paul's comments about how we've got to figure out where we set the rates, but we don't know the cost, and we can't, et cetera. You got a chicken and egg there. I mean, this gets us much quicker to the total cost of the project, so that when we, do go to the ratepayers, we've got a much greater level of certainty, both in what the rates need to be, and also that they're not going to change, and those kinds of things. So, I mean, that's that's part of this, right? I mean, that's
That's
pretty
a
huge,
major
huge
advantage
piece,
of this
yeah.
approach.
But
Another addition to that is the, once we get the costs set by the contract, we also eliminate the change order syndrome that has plagued many major projects through, in that the change orders are all within those three elements within the single contract, and so that virtually eliminates that process from the cities in the JPA unless there's a major change through regulatory environment or something like that.
yeah, I mean, I really appreciate that, because I think when we're in the world of ratepayers and bond financing, doing anything that's much different than this puts us at just a great risk of having to go back to ratepayers, having to redo bonds. You know, there's a cost to that, both politically and financially, of course, for cities. So it seems like this, you know, this process matches pretty well the world that we're living in for a project like this, with the ratepayers and the bonds and so on. But writing the contract for this, I can't even begin to imagine how complex that is. And I won't ask for a showing of hands of how many people are sitting in the audience who are paying attention to how the teams are going to be assembled and so on and so forth, because I know nobody would put their hand, everybody would have their hand up. But Dick, what's the experience of other jurisdictions in writing these contracts? I mean, are we going to be hopefully, you know, standing on the shoulders of others who've gone through this and suffered?
That's a big part of the reason why, before your arrival on the board, the agency retained this fellow, Eric Peterson, an attorney who has done, we investigated him, and as I told the board when we were doing our recruitment for Mr. Peterson, he's a New York lawyer, and I really didn't want to hire a New York lawyer. But son of a gun, he's the guy for this kind of work. He's done projects up and down the West Coast, including many in California, including many using the same government code authority that we will be relying on. So Mr. Peterson will take the lead on developing those contract documents with Mr. Yost and his team, and I will have more of an oversight role on the contract documents.
And let me just add to that Seattle and San Diego have been very cooperative, and they're sharing all of their, Jerry Gilbert basically has access to all of their contract documents, and so we'll get a real head start on this whole process.
Yep.
Great. And then how do we make sure, you know, and I read through these things, but could you just speak a little bit to how we make sure as jurisdictions, you know, we build in the control that we might decide we want? Because I can foresee through this process that we get off to a spectacular start where we've got all the creative juices flowing and the teams come together and we select a successful team. But you know, what happens when we get 12 years out into this and, you know, we realize, you know, maybe there's other jurisdictions that want to participate in our project or something like that. There's a buyout or there's flexibility. Can you just say some things to let me know how that works? And
we were talking about that earlier. We haven't finally decided a recommendation of the board on what the operation term would be, but it would probably be in the neighborhood of 15 years, possibly with options to extend. And if prior to that 15 years you wanted to make a change, a couple things. One is everything is negotiable. So if you wanted to expand the contract or expand the project or bring in a new player, that could be negotiable. Secondly, there will be a buyout clause in the contract. So for a certain financial price, the agency could buy out the operation term early. And then the other major protection you have through this type of contract, it's very important to develop in these contract documents that Mr. Peterson has a specialty in, is to have really clear performance criteria and performance obligations. So there's a very, very strong performance criteria that you can measure operation performance against. And so those are the principal protections. But it is, you know, for that operation term, you need to be very comfortable with that operations contractor, because it will be a long-term relationship. I don't know if I answered your question, and Jim, you may have something to add.
Yeah, I just wanted to add that these provisions aren't just delivery of water of a certain quality. We will have provisions for them to maintain equipment. We will have the ability to go in and inspect that equipment and see if they're satisfying those provisions. So, you know, one of the big fears a lot of people have is that 20 years from now you'll take this over and it'll be a big wreck. That will not happen, I can guarantee you that. You know, there's
Yeah.
just many ways to protect yourself against that.
Yeah, no, that's appreciated, and actually very much. I wasn't thinking so much of kind of if you get into a situation where you feel somebody is underperforming. I think it's more the situation where you've changed circumstances in one way or another, and you're thinking, gosh, I wish we had put this element into it. So the renegotiation of any contract is obviously at your disposal. I think what I would be looking for is to make sure that the buyout provision is fairly I don't want to say advantageous, but it's a clear, solid opportunity, because if you're renegotiating with a single party, and as long as you have the prospect of buying out, if you really need to buy out, then you kind of have the opportunity to reopen competition, 8 years in, 9 years in, and hopefully you don't do that. But if the circumstances are really that different, you want to be fair to the person who's in the contract now, but you also want to give the agency an ability to change course, which may have nothing to do with poor performance by the person in the contract. Just something happens, somebody else offers you a water right, another jurisdiction's going to come in, something happens, you need to do that. So that's my only thought there. So that's all. Thanks.
Good. Steve?
Well, to play off of a little bit what Joe was just talking about, I mean, that was my concern too when I looked at the operations side of it, because we have to have a very tight contractual language that, for me, performance is key, because I want the equipment kept and fearful of what it may cost us if it's not. And if it isn't, and performance isn't measured, and we don't have the proper provisions within the contract to not financially create a greater burden upon us that we think we're alleviating by having an operation by a private entity, then I think we could be in trouble down the road. So my guess is that this legal document is going to be pretty thick. It's not some small document that we normally see as council members. This is going to be probably one of the biggest legal documents we've ever seen. And that's why we've hired such a firm that has these on the shelf that they've been able to use throughout the country many a times, and in the state of California, as we reviewed, the chair and myself, the entities that we were seeking to be our legal representation in this arena. The one area, at least for me, is in the contract too, that I think is vital to be able to spread some of the benefits financially that'll be accrued by building and designing and then operating this project, but in particular in the building aspect of it, has to do with the provision of structuring the contract that gives local contractors a piece of the pie, so that it's not just all out of state, lower state, but it's within the state and locally, so that the resources that we will be extracting from our ratepayers has a little life cycle of its own, and it's recycled back within our potential communities of the surrounding areas. So I think that was key to me, and as I read, that was one of the provisions that led me to believe that the DBO is the method that I prefer to go down when it comes to this project, and I think it's good. Now, Mr. Meyer, you did say virtually when you talked about change orders and excluding outside factors that we have no control over, state new requirements, discoveries that occur while the project's occurring, who knows what it may be. That's so that to me is the other key component, is reducing that vulnerability for change orders and increased cost, again coming back with an increased cost that we thought we were going to save and we end up not saving it. So can you alleviate that or explain to me what you mean by virtually?
Well, virtually was put in there for the purposes of what you just put out, a regulatory change, an unforeseen material defect that we find out. Those are the kind of things that we would look at. Or if another community wanted to come in and we had to resize or something along those lines, those would be the change orders. Other than that, there are no other change orders. And I think the point here is that all of our work is going to be in that contract up front and making that contract a solid document that will prevent those activities. We won't have to face those any longer.
May I comment on that also?
Well, I was,
Oh, go ahead, Bob.
and maybe Jim's going to say what I'm going to say, because I'd put this differently, but maybe I'm more of a conservative engineer type. You know, whether you call it a change order or an addition to the contract, you know, it all comes down to how well you write your contract package and the specs. If during the course of construction, an issue comes up that isn't adequately addressed, it's likely going to be an extra if the city has an opinion on how it's going to come out. If they leave it to the contractor, it may not cost us anything, but if we realize, oops, we really have an opinion on that, there could be situations that could add cost to it.
Right.
I just wanted to add, Steve, that one of the ways that the contract will be structured is to define risk and share risk appropriately, and things like increase in power costs. We will not expect the contractor to have a set power cost in here. We as the agency will absorb the increases in power costs, because if you lay it on the contractor, it ends up costing you more than if you just paid the increase yourself. So that's another way to keep the change orders down, is appropriately define risk and allocate those appropriately.
So from a risk perspective, hopefully this doesn't happen, but say the cost of steel goes up dramatically, and all that piping that has to go between the treatment facility and the cities, and between the intake facility and the treatment facility. That's a lot of steel, an awful lot of steel. That can affect price dramatically, and if we come in, if a contractor goes out there and gives us a price for all of that plumbing, and all of a sudden the market on steel, or the providers of steel, for whatever reason, have seen a 10–15% jump, how are we assured that that's not going to be passed on to us, or is it going to be passed on to us?
I would say it will be handled very much like the power costs that I described earlier. We'll have provisions in the contract that say, here are the expectations from our joint negotiation of this contract regarding cost increases. If the excursions are outside those expectations, the agency will be faced with increasing costs.
And then I guess the last question along these lines. So the normal contracts that I've seen throughout my 6 years on the council always had a 10% contingency fee built into them. Are we going to still see a 10% contingency fee built into this contract?
All I can say is this is going to be a very competitive process, and so the folks that are going to be submitting bids are going to be submitting bids competitively, and they'll have to be as competitive as they can be to win.
Okay.
Now, you know, I don't want to also give the impression that cost is going to be the sole determinant on the selection process here, but it
Yeah.
will be very important.
Quality of delivery of that project is very important too.
Yeah.
And there's a
Stephen,
price
just-
sometimes for that.
Just to put it in context, I mean, for the more typical design, bid, build project where a contingency exists, primarily for change orders, the uncertainty of things that may come up during construction. In this case, that could be equivalent to paying for increased power costs or paying for increased steel costs. So it may be appropriate for staff to ask JPA to have a contingency that staff has access to should some of these uncertainties come up that are outside of the contractor's responsibility under the terms of our contract.
So the language will have to be really tight when it comes to speaking to what those circumstances might be. Communications protocol. And I think it's a good thing, because I know what has happened in the past with construction projects, and myself and other council members. We'll get taken to golf, we'll be taken to lunch, we'll be barraged with answers, questions, requests, and it I think, muddies the process. Now, we're entrusting you too, if this communications protocol is adapted, to be our eyes and ears and fair as all of us would be. And so there's a lot of trust going into that. Now, when it comes to the process, I'm sure we're going to be involved in many of the potential interviews, review of the potential RFQ that goes out, review of the RFP that goes out, all of that, so that we have oversight over that. But it takes us out of the process of being lobbied, and I prefer that. Now, if people want to go play golf with me, I'll go play golf with you any time, but I don't want to hear about the project.
All right. Marty?
Thank you. Just quickly, I would have expected Eric to be involved, or Peterson, sorry, not this Eric, with the contracts, because that's what we talked about as his big strength. But is he also going to be involved in the RFQ, RFP, or is that going to be local staff?
No, those are part of the contract documents, and he will be involved in
So
all
we'll be
those steps.
utilizing his expertise on those,
Yes.
too? Okay. And then, actually, I had sort of a question along that line, if there were, because we're going to go to quarterly meetings after January, and I don't want to lose touch with this process, so are there opportunities for a board subcommittee to participate directly with the staff?
That's fine with us. No, definitely. If that's the will of the board, and we're open to working together with you, and so that we don't want any surprises. And so if it requires additional meetings or special meetings, we'll be glad to have that. Or if there's a subcommittee, whatever makes the most sense.
Yeah, you have a really long time frame here, but I would rather see the sausage being made than sort of the end product, as it were.
Upon your approval of our recommendation, the first key step in terms of actually putting something out would be in March. And so we have ample opportunity to interface with you prior to that time, so you're not surprised with what's going out. And
Okay.
that'd be the request for qualifications.
Okay. I don't know how the rest of the board feels about a subcommittee participating with staff on this.
Yeah, I think we can entertain that as we advance in the process. I
Okay.
think probably a little premature right now, in my view.
It's
Right.
just one of my margin notes.
Yeah. Any other questions?
No.
I have no questions. Thank you for the presentation, and do we need to open some kind of a public hearing on this?
Not a hearing, but see if there's any public comments.
Okay. Any public comments any of you wish to make? Thought one of you'd give us the score.
They haven't
We
started
got
yet.
about 10 minutes.
About 10 minutes.
All right. I'll make a motion to adopt this resolution.
It's a long motion. You want me to read the whole motion?
Just a staff
Or
recommendation.
just move the recommendation?
Yeah. I
Okay,
move the
I'll second.
recommendation the way it's worded. All in favor?
Aye.
Aye.
Opposed? None. Thank you.
We're going to record Mr. Cravoza as
Mr. Cravoza,
abstain on this one because he's out, had to go do something.
yeah.
He's coming back, I know. Can he
Can
re-record?
can we, since we're in the same meeting, can we accept his vote when he comes back in?
Right.
Okay? I think it's an important enough item that I'd like to have all four members having voted on it. So if the rest of you concur, we'll,
I concur. I think we should have him vote on it. So I know he's coming back because he left his iPhone right over there, and he wouldn't
Yeah.
be leaving with his iPhone
he
there.
had to make a quick call.
Okay.
So, all right. Moving on to the other item, I want to say just a couple of things before we launch into a whole lot of discussion on this. First of all, I am not prepared to adopt a motion on this item at this particular meeting. I brought it up because I wanted to have a little discussion about it. I think it's premature to adopt a motion because we do not know if the Board of Supervisors has a desire as a board to even participate in this type of form. And so I view it as premature, although we could certainly authorize our general manager at the conclusion of this item to engage in that kind of a conversation and have the board weigh in, the Board of Supervisors, I mean by that, weigh in on their interest. Let me also say that I would my personal preference is to have a staff recommendation on the item before we move to adopt the resolution, and we have no particular staff recommendation. So for that second reason, I'd like to postpone any formal action on a resolution in that regard. So having said those couple of things, let's halt for a minute and reopen the previous item. And
Mr. Chair, if I could recommend a two-step process on the first item is somebody make a motion to reconsider agenda item 5 and re-vote on the matter, have that motion heard and decided. If the motion to reconsider passes, then reconsider item 5.
I move we reconsider item 5.
Second.
All in favor?
Aye.
Aye. The reason, Joe, we voted 3-0, but we wanted to reopen the item to hopefully have all of the members of this board, since this is just such an important item in the future of this agency, and that's the only reason we're reopening it.
We didn't want you to have an abstention on the record for this item.
Sorry to slow you down. I didn't think I was going to be out that long. Good. Okay.
So with that, I'll make a motion again to
Move the staff.
to move the staff recommendation on this item.
I'll second.
All in favor?
Aye.
Aye.
Aye. Opposed? 0.
Thanks. Apologies. Good.
All right. So in any event, those were just the couple of caveats I wanted to say at the outset. And with that, I'll just open the discussion. I know that Eric has had some experience with boards with non-voting members on the board and the collaboration that it can bring about. And so let's just hear from members of the board here as to whether, or why don't we hear first from you, Eric? Let me do that and let you discuss that a little bit from your vantage point and perspective, and then we'll just give each board member an opportunity to weigh in on questions or feelings they might have.
Well, from my viewpoint, I compare it to my experience in having worked for the Freeport Regional Water Authority. And the Freeport Regional Water Authority had a 4-member board, 2 members from the Sacramento County Water Agency and 2 members from East Bay Municipal Utility District, 2 board members. There was a 5th board member, an associate member, and that was a city council person from the city of Sacramento. That person, each of the board members from both Sacramento County Water Agency and East Bay MUD had a vote. So there was 4 votes. The representative from the city of Sacramento did not have a vote. The city of Sacramento did not have a financial investment in the project, but we're certainly involved in the project in that many of the facilities, the key facilities, were on city of Sacramento property or in roadways. The observation that I had with regard to that was it was a very collaborative board, and there was a lot of input received from the city. The city was in a position to make their position known, either for some actions we took or tempered some of the actions we took, or in most of the time in concurrence with everything that we were doing. I felt it was a positive thing because it brought the whole region together. It gave a greater strength, a significance to the agency in that it had a better representation from more political bodies. It helped, I believe, in strengthening abilities to open doors for us in terms of pursuing grants and in other activities associated with permitting, where we represented a bigger group. I believe it demonstrated to the public that this water really is confined facility-wise by political boundaries, but really it's extends beyond political boundaries, and it's regional, of regional value to many, many people, and that it is not something that's to be dealt with because there's a project, but it's the whole concept that this is something that's ongoing for decades, centuries in terms of needs, and that everybody benefits with a cooperative working environment. So those were my observations and how I thought it was a positive situation at Freeport. And the analogy here is it's very similar in that we have two agencies represented by two city council people from each city who are paying the freight. There is a third agency, and this happens to be the county, Yolo County, who do not have financial interest, but certainly are looking out for the broader picture in terms of the future, in terms of water resources, and in fact have, I believe, a very important project being studied in through the Yolo County Flood Control and Conservation District, which could perhaps interface with us in providing us supplemental water supply and strengthen the water resources within the whole county. So there are, and plus the fact a number of our facilities are in Yolo County, and we do need to interface with Yolo County with regards to encroachment permits and other property and right-of-way issues. So there's a lot of similarity. So that's my observation.
Okay. Director Souza.
Yeah, I think for me, it's been on my mind as to how do we fold in the county into some form of a participation, and not only just from, not from an informal fashion, but from a very formal fashion. And we wrote the bylaws in such a fashion that it allowed us, in fact, what is it, section 4.2.1, allowed us to be able to do this. We have a participating agency of the University of California, Davis, and they're sometimes here, sometimes not. They don't formally, they've never formally sat up here on the dais. They don't actually even have a formal, except for being a participating agency, they've never been up here. And that I found rather interesting. And I don't think we're even, your suggestion isn't even asking that of the county. I think it's just, it's formalizing a relationship, and if we want them to be in a more participatory fashion, to be here for the discussion purposes, that may even be, that may be good. But I think the first question you ask is probably the most relevant. Do they even want to? And if they don't want to, then, and they have to take formal actions. And so the question is, which comes first? Us inviting, or they taking action and requesting?
Well, a good question, and certainly we could take action to initiate that process. Let me give a little more history to it, which may influence some of your comments so that they don't come out afterwards. I did raise this issue at our last 2-by-1 meeting with the chairman of the Board of Supervisors and with Mike McGowan, who were the two supervisors at that meeting, and indicated that I would be bringing it to this body for discussion as to the possibility of a member of the board being a non-voting member of this group. Reception wasn't immediately, yes, we want to do that, so I think that's part of why I pose the question of we may want to engage that discussion ahead of our voting to put them on, and then have them say, no, we don't want to be on.
Well, and because, you know, I've missed the last two of those meetings, and I think they've become more frequent in the last month, almost every 2 weeks, which to me, it wasn't what I expected from that body. And my preference would be to take it out of a boardroom, non-agendized fashion, and put it into this boardroom, or the boardrooms we meet at, and make it a more formalized discussion, because it's now open to the public, and the public gets to hear those discussions. frankly, at times, it's necessary to have those discussions as we have, and we will here tonight in closed session. But, and as written, they won't participate in any of those discussions that we would have. But it at least sheds more light on what the county's concerns are for the public to hear them, because they'd be able to voice them. So I'm supportive of the action. And so it really comes down to, do we want to formally ask them, and hopefully they don't shun us and turn us away, and that they see it as something positive. That would be my hope. It is from me, and I believe from you also, it's a positive reaching out.
Marty?
Wow, I have a bunch of notes on this one. First of all, for me, it makes sense for UCD to be a participating agency. They're the third member of the permit application. They're also going to be participating recipients of water through this
Maybe.
agent. Well, maybe.
Yeah, I think
I think that was the intent. And I assume that that's what the contract's going to be. Plus, if you look at the budgeting, they are participating financially with this agency. And I don't know if the county is a participating agency, will they participate financially?
I think part of at least my feeling in bringing this forward for discussion in the manner that it came, at least it was a discussion with Eric, was that they would be non-voting because they are non-paying. There would be no financial.
But I think UCD is also non-voting.
But and the UCD piece in my mind, and I may have it all haywire, but the UCD piece in my mind still awaits a UCD decision. And in my mind, if UCD does become a paying partner receiving water, this board would probably want to entertain some action to alter who's sitting up here.
Yeah, I've also...
Yeah. That to me would be logical, but again, that is in my mind premature, because we still don't know where UCD is gonna stand in relation to participating in the water. So,
And you're correct, Mr. Marble. And just on that, I might add, and Mr. Mishi talked about this in his staff report at the beginning of the meeting, a contract of participation has been drafted, and it's being reviewed, and the university's attorney and I have been playing phone tag the last couple of days, so work is moving forward on that matter, and we hope to be bringing it back to the board soon.
Yeah. If they become a participating agency, will the 2x1x1 continue? Or does it actually have any function at that point?
well, the difference at the 2x1x1, I'm with Steve. The frequency is killing me, but the 2x1x1 engages city managers. It engages staff at the engineering level. It engages Mr. Mishi. It engages county council. It engages the county CAO and the assistant CAO. So it engages other people, and seems to me to go beyond the scope of just discussions about the agency.
Okay. Mr. Nishi, you make a compelling argument, because some of the facilities will certainly be in county property or county land. But going to the last paragraph, this agency may consult and cooperate with the participating agency, the county, regarding project design, planning, implementation, and countywide and regional water planning, management, and conjunctive use issues. And that seemed to me to be beyond this agency's charge, which is to procure the water, treat the water, and get it to two cities and the UCD.
The language you just quoted from is actually pulled out of the Joint Powers Agreement, so the JPA did acknowledge that there may be some role for the agency through these participating agencies to have this, planning effort, recognizing that with this project, the JPA becomes a major player in the county water community, and as such, maybe you should have a role, or at least a participation, discussion role in these various planning efforts.
It just seems to me the WRA is much better suited to that because it has a broader membership. It truly represents county-wide.
Right.
This agency really doesn't.
Yeah, I think the scope of what we're doing, we clearly understand, but just to add a comment to that mix, we all know that all water matters are integrated. And so it's virtually impossible to isolate the function, in my mind, of this agency to an exclusive get water, provide it, that kind of a thing, without sticking our heads in the sand in regards to the entire water scope of what's going on county-wide and statewide. So I think that language isn't meant to expand scope.
Okay.
In my mind, it would be meant just to allow for integration in a way that could be deemed proper or needed given the circumstances of particular water goings on.
Well, at this point, I'm not really ready to take action on this item. I'd rather it come back.
Okay. Joe?
Yeah, I would just I would just say that it does seem to me that in carrying out the pointed mission of the CWA, we touch so many other parties and so many of them in the county and so many issues. And so I think that what we're doing here has such importance to the county. Certainly, a vast majority of the residents of the county, and I worry that people are making assumptions about what we're doing that are maybe unfounded. That we're going broader than our scope or something. And I can almost think of no better way to kind of dispel those concerns than to really be as transparent as possible. And welcoming the county to sit at this table, if they so choose, would seem to me to be a kind of a wonderful gesture in doing that. It looks like they might, take the path of the university, and I haven't seen them here yet, but I think they know that they can show up. So I would certainly lean in the direction of extending the offer to the county. I also think the county might be, almost in a certain sense, a really outstanding marketing partner for us. I mean, it's very important that they know what we're doing, and over time, others may, like the university, want to join with us, and making sure that that's coordinated with the county makes sense. WRA, I think, is a good idea. We may want to be participating in the WRA more formally and so on, but I think that's might be a little bit different. So I'd go in this direction. The only question I have is kind of the, who goes first, and if Board Member Doty were comfortable with it, I would think that having our general manager and hopefully our chair going actually to the County Board of Supervisors and appearing and saying that this opportunity to participate has been discussed at our level, and we would like to ask if they are interested, and if they are interested, we'd like to then go down the road. I think we kind of put them on the spot if we elect to invite them and they turn us down. That's awkward. But I think if we had a general feeling here that we'd like to let them know that if they want to be invited, they would be invited, or however that would go, I would be in favor of going in that direction.
Okay. Now, I have a couple of quick questions. One is, does this agency have the authority to add board members in that fashion without going back to cities? Or does
to
it,
add a voting board member?
no, to add a non-voting member?
Yes, you have that authority.
Okay, so that would not have to go back to the cities
Correct.
for some approval. And would the board then have the ability, if once the operation, at a certain point in time, if it was deemed we don't need to be here anymore, kind of a thing, to have the county be able to be not a member of the board at that point. That would seem to me to be equally as viable as bringing them on, equally legal.
Interesting question, Mr. Marble. The Joint Powers Agreement sets forth a mechanism and a process and authority to, by resolution, designate a participating agency to then participate in open session meetings, et cetera, whatnot. It really doesn't set forth a process for how to undo that, so that might be somewhat awkward. Joint Powers Agency Board of Directors runs the board, and I suspect you could undo it in the same way you did it, but it's not contemplated for in the Joint Powers Agreement.
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah, I had thought about that too. Going through this, I was thinking if we get there, the solution might be to extend the invitation for 2 or 3 years, subject to renewal. And quite frankly, that gives them the opportunity to opt in or opt out. And
or through completion operation.
Exactly right. It could well be that we get through certain stages of the project, and they would just as soon, be, freed of the obligation. So that's the general approach that might be comfortable for both parties.
I concur with that, because I think the main dialogue is occurring while we're beginning the discussions, the construction primarily, because it's the construction that they've had a great concern about, because it's primarily in county area. And they want to have some feedback on what it's doing to habitat, what it's doing to farming activities, and that's a big concern. What it's doing to the water that's in the county, all of that. That's been a great concern in the 2x1x1 meetings we've had. So you have more questions, but I'm ready to make a motion.
Yeah, I just want to discuss a little of the way I've juxtaposed these feelings in my own mind. When we voted as council members to incorporate the JPA, I guess incorporate's not the correct legal word, but to do whatever we did to make the JPA happen, we had this discussion in a minimal way. We didn't ever entertain the option really of having the county be a non-voting member. The issue we discussed was whether there should be any more members at this board, a 5th member to break a tie vote. Our discussion at that point in time, as I recall, was we don't want a 5th member to break a tie vote because we want to be in harmony with what we're doing. And even though that may seem like an impossible thing in the world today, that was our desire. And this first ever venture between Davis and Woodland was to have something that kept us unified and that was successful in doing it together. And from that standpoint, we then decided to exclude the county. And I still agree with that personally. And in some ways, however, I believe it was perhaps a little short-sighted on our part, and this is my personal feeling, because the county is so intimately involved with the permitting process that we have to be involved with the land use of the areas that we're going through, and can be very helpful in terms of advocacy at both federal and state levels. I think that them feeling like they are somehow part of it would be an advantage to the agency. And anything that we can do, in my mind, to improve that spirit of cooperation and collaboration and transparency is valuable. Does it mean then, because we have a joint intake facility, that we need to add another board member, and because we have Knight's Landing now involved somehow, that we need to add them? Well, I think you can take it a little too far, but I think the county clearly has stakes to play that are part of this project, and that's really why I brought it up, is if we can improve that spirit of collaboration. Some of it has happened with the 2x1x1, but I think there's a lot more to it than that could be, if they're willing. And I think the other part that I wrestle with in my mind is they may feel like, well, we don't want to be part of something that we don't vote in. Why would we do that? And so they may say, no, if you want to make us a voting member, fine, but otherwise, forget it. And I probably would understand that feeling, but I'm hopeful that it could bring about a spirit of collaboration. So anyway, that's where I'm coming from. Marty?
Yeah, thank you, Mr. Chairman. I remember the meeting when we were talking about the structure of the board, and at that point, well, I think my comment was that I just didn't see a fit for the county in this project, simply because it was a narrow project, and in my mind, didn't really involve a sort of the broad regional aspect that the county has. And I think I said that we're adults and we can play nicely in the sandbox, 2 and 2. We can get along. We can get along. To make a change like that in the board structure, add the what is it called, the participating agency, to me, there has to be a value to this agency to do that, and 2 or 3 of you have mentioned what those values are. I especially like the part of not just that they're going to be seeing this project going to be built in the county, but also that perhaps they can become advocates for us, where they see the value of what we're trying to do. So if you want to make a motion, I will support the request that we go to the county and ask to see if they want to participate as a participating agency, non-voting.
Okay. Greg?
Yeah, I just wanted to make one comment from a staff perspective. I think that the value of the county participating, I really see that. I see the value there. But the county's interests are far-ranging and have a very large scope. And as staff perspective, we want to serve the board with providing the information that's desired, and adding the county will add a whole nother layer of complexity. If their scope of participation remains within the scope of the JPA, I think it's very valuable. I think it's good. I just would be concerned that adding a group that has such far-ranging scope and so many interests that may be on the edge or periphery of the activities could overload staff trying to respond to those issues. I just wanted to bring that up.
I think very good comment. And we don't want, this agency is not to replace the WRA, and
No.
not intended to. I enjoy that too much anyway, so. But that's well spoken in my mind. Eric, do you actually general managed that at that level? Did that become an issue in terms of staff, increased load on staff, or delving out of the arena?
No, in Freeport, no, it did not.
Okay.
It was really focused on implementing our program.
Okay.
Chair Marble? First off, it's top of the second, nothing.
Thank you.
Thank you.
You're welcome. And second, I would move that we authorize the general manager, Mishi, and Chair Marble to go to the Yolo County Board of Supervisors and ask if they would like to be participating members in this agency.
Non-voting.
Non-voting participating members of this agency, yes.
Okay. Second?
Oh, I'll second. Sorry.
All in favor? Aye?
Aye.
Right.
I think, the caveat is if they give us a thumbs up, we'd move forward to put this on the January agenda, and maybe even put it on the front end of the agenda, and if they want to get their rep here, then we can get it going. I mean, some of the big issues with the county are going on right now, so, pushing this off until, whatever the meeting is after January, February, March.
Our next board meeting is actually December 9th.
Oh, that's right. Yeah, okay. So, yeah.
We'll see.
Good.
Yeah, we've already we have a resolution ready to go.
That's right.
Yeah.
And maybe we need to invite them on the 9th, and then they can, get us somebody formally by the January meeting. See how that works.
Okay, board will adjourn into closed session.
Oh, we have
What
one
did I
other.
miss?
Number 7, item 7,
Sorry.
the authorizing general manager to retain special real property
Okay.
attorney.
Excuse me. Yes, this request is for a special real property counsel, and I'll let Mr. Shanahan define that need for you.
Thank you, Eric. As the board knows from our closed session discussions in past meetings, I don't want to get into a lot of detail in this open session meeting, but we are moving forward with a proposed water transaction and to provide fill the summer water supply need for the agency. That transaction's a significant one, and it has a significant, a few provisions that are going to be very unique from a California real property law perspective. And my partner in Alan Lilly, and I were talking about it, and we requested the general manager within the scope of our budget to have authority to bring on a special local real estate counsel to advise us on security interest in California real property, and it would help with this moving this transaction forward that's on a very aggressive schedule.
Marty?
How are you going to choose the person?
Through qualifications and recommendations and expertise.
So will it be broadly request for response?
No, it would not be. It would be more of a sole source. There's not that many people who do the kind of work we're looking for. We're looking for somebody who's really seasoned in doing, in the region, who's done a lot of real estate title work and secured real property transactions. And the other issue is, Ms. Doty, it's got to be we got to move fairly quickly because the agreements are moving forward as we speak.
Is this in our current budget?
Yes.
Okay.
Questions? Any other questions?
Yeah, Dick, I think the City of Davis now and the City of Woodland are retaining the same law firm. Is there reasons why that presents a conflict or not, or is even a good thing to angle toward, or but otherwise I'm comfortable deferring to you to figure it out.
Yeah, I don't
Yeah.
think it's the same guy.
Yeah.
Yeah, I think because we're looking for someone just to represent the agency
On this narrower
on this
topic.
narrow
Yeah.
issue. Yep.
Okay, fine.
You good to go?
Yeah, my only thing is I don't know why you're proposing to do it within the budget, because it seems like this is a big ticket thing, but obviously you'll come back to us if you need to later in the year. So.
Yep.
Okay. Anybody do we need a
I'll
motion, or
move the
you just
item.
need direction?
It's been moved, I'll second it.
All in favor?
Aye.
Motion carries unanimously. Now we'll go to closed session.
Yes, six outs so far straight, 6 up, 6 down for the
Really?
Texas Rangers, bottom of the second.
last night.
Yeah, Kane.
Members of the board are here in the chambers. We report that board gave the agency negotiator direction in regards to the negotiations that are part of the agenda item. We have a motion to adjourn? Second, all in favor? Aye.